The transmission crackled through the quantum relay stations, scattered across the outer rim of Terran space, a desperate whisper in the cosmic dark that hadn't been heard for nearly 2 decades. Admiral Sarah Chen sat in her office aboard Orbital Command Station Prometheus, watching the rain streak down the massive viewport that offered a view of Earth's blue marble below. The planet looked peaceful from here, almost serene, but she knew better than most what lay beneath that deceptively calm surface. "Admiral," came the voice of her aide, Lieutenant Commander Torres, his usually steady tone carrying an edge of uncertainty. "You need to see this. Priority 1 transmission from the Galactic Council's emergency frequencies." Chen turned from the viewport, her weathered face showing the lines earned from 30 years of military service, most of it spent in the void between stars. The lieutenant commander's expression told her this wasn't routine bureaucratic chatter from the Council's sprawling administrative complex on Centauri Prime. "Put it through to my secure terminal," she ordered, settling into her chair as the holographic display materialized before her. The image that appeared made her blood run cold. It was Ambassador Kethvar of the Zalani Confederation, one of the Council's founding members. The normally composed reptilian diplomat looked haggard, his usually pristine scales dulled with stress. Behind him, she could see the unmistakable signs of emergency lighting and the hurried movement of evacuation procedures. "Admiral Chen," Kethvar's voice carried the weight of desperation that Chen had heard only once before, 20 years ago during the Void War. "I am transmitting on behalf of the Galactic Council's emergency session. We need the Terran Federation's assistance. Specifically, we need your darkest fleet." The request hit Chen like a physical blow. The darkest fleet. Even the name carried weight that most beings in the galaxy preferred to forget. Officially, the fleet had been decommissioned after the Void War, its crews pensioned off, its ships relegated to distant storage yards around the outer system gas giants. Unofficially, everyone knew better. "Ambassador," Chen replied carefully, "the vessels you're referring to were retired from active service following the armistice of 2387. The Terran Federation has honored its commitment to peaceful coexistence with our galactic neighbors." Kethvar's laugh was bitter and hollow. "Admiral, please. We both know those ships weren't destroyed, merely stored, and their crews weren't discharged, merely transferred to inactive reserves. The Council has been content to let this fiction stand because it meant we could sleep peacefully, knowing that humanity's most terrifying capabilities were kept locked away. But now..." The transmission flickered, and Chen could hear the sound of explosions in the background. When the image stabilized, Kethvar was bleeding from a cut above his left eye, and the emergency lighting behind him had shifted to deep red. "The Devourers have returned, Admiral. They've broken through the barrier fleet at the Andromeda Junction. 17 star systems have already gone dark. The hegemony's finest battle groups lasted less than 6 hours against them. The Christine Collective's planet killers were swept aside like debris. We've lost contact with 3 entire member species." Chen felt her mouth go dry. The Devourers. She'd hoped never to hear that name again. The original war against them had cost the galaxy nearly 10% of its inhabited worlds, before humanity had developed the weapons and tactics needed to drive them back into the void between galaxies. The price of that victory had been steep enough that the other species had insisted on the Darkest Fleet's retirement once the immediate threat was over. "How many?" she asked quietly. "Our intelligence suggests this wave is 3 times the size of the original incursion. They've adapted, Admiral. Our previous weapons are ineffective. They've learned to counter the hegemony's gravitational weapons, to absorb the collective's crystalline energy beams. Nothing we throw at them slows them down." The transmission cut to a tactical display showing the Andromeda Junction, a critical hyperspace nexus that connected 3 major galactic arms. What Chen saw made her stomach clench. The traditional neat formations of Allied fleets were gone, replaced by scattered debris fields and the ominous dark spots that marked worlds consumed by the Devourers' planet-stripping technology. "What makes you think the Darkest Fleet will fare any better than your current forces?" Chen asked, though she already knew the answer. "Because," Kethvar replied, "humanity doesn't fight like the rest of us. You come from a death world that spent millions of years trying to kill you, and instead of making you cautious, it made you creative, ruthless. When the rest of us develop weapons, we create tools of war. When humanity does it, you create instruments of absolute destruction. The Darkest Fleet wasn't just powerful, Admiral. It was terrifying in ways that made even our enemies hesitate." Chen closed her eyes, remembering the classified reports that still gave her nightmares. Ships designed not just to destroy enemy vessels, but to psychologically break their crews. Weapons that violated so many interstellar conventions that humanity had been asked to sign a separate peace treaty, promising never to use them against other Council species. Tactics that had earned humanity the grudging respect of the galaxy, along with a healthy dose of fear. "The Council voted to request Terran assistance," Kethvar continued. "The vote was unanimous, Admiral. Even the Pacifist Coalition and the Harmony Communes voted yes. They're that desperate. We're transmitting full intelligence packages and offering complete resource allocation to support whatever operations you deem necessary." The transmission ended, leaving Chen staring at the tactical data that continued to stream across her display. World after world going dark, fleets disappearing, entire civilizations being consumed by an enemy that seemed unstoppable. She thought of the crews scattered across Earth's surface, many of them trying to live normal lives after years of warfare that had left them permanently changed. Captain Morrison, who'd taken up teaching at the academy but still woke up screaming some nights. Commander Yang, who'd tried farming but couldn't handle the peaceful silence. Lieutenant Colonel Brooks, who'd become a hermit in the Canadian wilderness because crowds made her reach for weapons that were no longer there. They'd all served aboard the ships of the Darkest Fleet, vessels with names like Inevitable End, Final Solution, and her own former command, the Absolute Zero. Ships designed by humans who'd grown up on a world that regularly tried to kill them with everything from microscopic diseases to continental-scale disasters. Ships crewed by people who'd learned that sometimes the only way to save what you love is to become something that your enemies fear more than death itself. Chen activated her command console and began pulling up files that had been classified beyond top secret, accessing crew rosters that officially didn't exist and ship specifications that made her hands shake as she read them. The Darkest Fleet had been humanity's response to an enemy that showed no mercy and force that existed only to consume and destroy. In creating weapons capable of stopping such an enemy, humanity had crossed lines that most species couldn't even imagine approaching. But they had worked. The Devourers had been driven back, their fleets scattered, their advance stopped. The galaxy had been saved, and humanity had been asked to put away their most terrible weapons in exchange for a permanent seat on the Galactic Council and guaranteed autonomy within the Terran Federation's borders. Now, 20 years later, the galaxy was asking for those weapons to be brought back. Chen opened a communication channel to the Terran Federation's High Command. Fleet Admiral Jackson's face appeared on her screen, his expression grim. He'd obviously been briefing himself on the situation. "Sarah," he said without preamble, "I've been monitoring the Council's emergency broadcasts. How bad is it?" "Bad enough that they're asking for the Darkest Fleet to be reactivated," Chen replied. "The Devourers are back, sir, and this time they're prepared for conventional warfare. The Allied fleets are being slaughtered." Jackson was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming against his desk. Chen had served under him during the original war and knew he was weighing options that all carried terrible costs. "The President has given me emergency authorization," he finally said. If you believe the situation warrants it, you have permission to begin Darkest Fleet reactivation procedures. Full discretionary command authority, unlimited resource allocation, and suspension of all previous operational restrictions. Chen felt a chill run down her spine. Unlimited resource allocation meant that humanity was prepared to commit everything to this fight. Suspension of operational restrictions meant that the weapons and tactics that had been banned after the war were now back on the table. "How many ships, sir?" "All of them," Jackson replied. "Every vessel in the Darkest Fleet is to be brought back to operational status. Contact the reserve crews. Recall them to active duty. Authorization is already being transmitted to the storage facilities around Jupiter, Saturn, and Uranus. The ships will be ready for crew within 72 hours. Chen nodded, her mind already shifting into the mode that had earned her command of humanity's most feared naval formation. "What about the weapons, sir?" "The restricted ordnance?" "All restrictions lifted. Sarah, the galaxy is asking us to become monsters again. The question is, are we prepared to do what's necessary?" She thought of the tactical displays showing world after world going dark, of species that had taken millennia to evolve being snuffed out in hours, of civilizations that had reached for the stars only to be consumed by something that viewed sentient life as nothing more than raw material. "Yes, sir," she said quietly. "We are." Jackson nodded grimly. "Then may God forgive us all. Reactivate the Darkest Fleet, Admiral. Show the galaxy why Earth is considered a death world and why humanity earned its place among the stars through methods that still give our allies nightmares." As the transmission ended, Chen began the process of awakening humanity's most terrible creation. Within hours, coded messages would begin reaching former crew members scattered across Earth's surface. Men and women who'd tried to forget the things they'd done in humanity's name would be asked to remember, to return to ships designed for one purpose: the complete and utter destruction of humanity's enemies. The Darkest Fleet was coming back to life, and the galaxy would once again learn why humans were the only species to ever survive on a death world and then choose to leave it behind to hunt among the stars. Captain Jake Morrison was grading papers in his small office at the Naval Academy when the secure communication device in his desk drawer began to emit the sequence of tones he'd hoped never to hear again. 3 long notes, followed by 2 short ones. Then silence for exactly 7 seconds before the pattern repeated. He set down his stylus and stared at the drawer, his hands trembling slightly as the 20-year-old conditioning kicked in with brutal efficiency. The sound meant only one thing: the Darkest Fleet was being recalled to active duty. Morrison pulled out the device, a piece of hardware so heavily encrypted that it existed in a quantum superposition until activated by his biometric signature. The small screen displayed a simple message that made his blood run cold. "Report to Ganymede Station 1 within 48 hours. Priority Alpha. Your ship awaits. A. Chen." His ship. The inevitable end. A Retribution-class heavy destroyer that had earned its name by being the last thing 17 enemy fleets had ever seen. Morrison closed his eyes and tried not to remember the things he'd done aboard that vessel, the orders he'd given, the weapons he'd authorized. For 20 years, he'd taught young naval officers about honor, duty, and the rules of civilized warfare. None of his students knew that their mild-mannered instructor had once commanded a ship designed to terrorize enemies into surrender through sheer, overwhelming brutality. 3,000 miles away, in a small farming community in rural Montana, Commander Lisa Yang received an identical message while feeding chickens behind her modest farmhouse. She read it twice before the secure device automatically wiped itself, leaving no evidence of its existence except for the cold knot of dread forming in her stomach. Yang had been the weapons officer aboard the Absolute Zero, Admiral Chen's flagship, and she'd been very good at her job. Too good, perhaps, which was why she'd retreated to this quiet place, where her only responsibilities involved growing crops and tending livestock. She walked back to her farmhouse, her mind automatically calculating transit times and supply requirements. Old habits died hard, especially when they'd been forged in the crucible of interstellar warfare. Yang had spent 2 decades trying to forget the feeling of omnipotence that came with having enough firepower to crack planets at her fingertips. Now, it seemed, she would need to remember. Across the globe, similar scenes played out as the recall orders reached their intended recipients. Dr. Elena Vasquez, who'd been researching sustainable energy in Antarctica, stared at her message while ice crystals formed on her breath in the frigid air. Commander Marcus Johnson, working as a park ranger in Yellowstone, read his orders while watching a grizzly bear fish in a mountain stream. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Brooks, the hermit of the Canadian wilderness, found her message waiting when she checked her monthly supply drop. Each of them had tried to build new lives after the war, to find peace in pursuits that had nothing to do with the efficient destruction of enemy forces. Each had failed, in their own way, because you couldn't simply turn off the part of yourself that had been shaped by experiences that most people couldn't even imagine. They'd been soldiers in humanity's darkest hour, when the choice had been between becoming monsters or watching the galaxy burn. Now, that hour had come again. Admiral Chen stood on the observation deck of Ganymede Station 1, watching as the first of the Darkest Fleet's vessels emerged from their storage orbit around Jupiter. The ships had been maintained in perfect condition despite their official decommissioning, their hulls gleaming with the matte black coating that absorbed sensor scans and made them nearly invisible against the void. They were beautiful in the way that apex predators were beautiful, sleek, purposeful, and absolutely terrifying to anything that might be unlucky enough to encounter them. The inevitable end was among the first to dock, its distinctive profile unmistakable even at a distance. Chen had served aboard that ship during the final battles of the Void War, when they'd pushed the Devourers back beyond the galactic rim. She remembered the silence that fell over enemy communications whenever the end appeared on their sensors, the way entire fleets would sometimes attempt to withdraw rather than face what they knew was coming. Captain Morrison's shuttle docked 40 minutes later, and Chen was waiting for him in the airlock. He looked older than his 53 years, his brown hair now streaked with gray, and his eyes carrying the weight of 2 decades spent trying to forget. But his uniform was immaculate, and his bearing was that of a man who'd once commanded one of the most feared vessels in known space. "Admiral," Morrison said, offering a crisp salute. "Permission to come aboard." "Granted," Chen replied, returning the salute. "It's good to see you again, Jake. I wish it were under better circumstances." Morrison's smile was grim. "The circumstances are never better when they call us back, ma'am." "How bad is it this time?" Chen handed him a data tablet containing the latest intelligence reports from the Council fleets. Morrison's expression grew darker as he read, his military mind automatically processing the tactical implications of each disaster. "3 times the size of the original incursion," he murmured. "Adapted to counter our previous advantages, and they've learned to coordinate their attacks better." He looked up at Chen, his eyes holding the cold calculation that had made him such an effective destroyer captain. "The Council forces aren't just losing, they're being systematically dismantled." "Which is why we're here," Chen confirmed. "The politicians have finally admitted what we've always known. Sometimes, the only way to stop a monster is to become something worse." Over the next 36 hours, the rest of the Darkest Fleet's crews arrived at Ganymede Station. They came from every continent on Earth, from orbital habitats and lunar colonies, from research stations in the asteroid belt and mining operations around Saturn. Some traveled in luxury civilian transports, others hitchhiked on cargo freighters or requisitioned military shuttles. They were united by their shared service aboard ships that had crossed lines most military officers couldn't even imagine approaching. Commander Yang arrived with soil under her fingernails and calluses from farm work, but her first stop was the weapons control center of the Absolute Zero. She ran her hands over the familiar consoles, remembering the weight of decisions that could end civilizations with a single command authorization. The ship's AI recognized her biometrics and began activating systems that had been dormant for 2 decades. "Welcome back, Commander Yang," the AI said in its perfectly modulated voice. "Weapon systems show green across all boards. Shall I begin pre-combat initialization sequences?" Yang hesitated for just a moment before responding. "Do it. Full combat readiness. Authorization Yang 77 Alpha." Throughout the fleet, similar scenes played out as crews reunited with the ships that had defined their military careers. The Broken Chains crew gathered on their bridge and performed the ritual inspection of their ship's most notorious weapon, the psychological warfare suite that had driven entire enemy fleets to surrender without firing a shot. The Final Solutions engineering team began the delicate process of activating their ship's reality shear drive, a propulsion system that folded space-time in ways that violated several fundamental laws of physics. Dr. Vasquez, now serving as Chief Science Officer aboard the Quantum Ghost, supervised the initialization of weapons that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The technology had been developed during the desperate final years of the Void War, when humanity had realized that conventional physics wasn't adequate to the task of stopping an enemy that could consume entire star systems. Admiral Chen convened a fleet briefing 72 hours after the first recall messages had been sent. The command staff of 23 ships gathered in the station's largest conference room, their faces reflecting the grim determination of people who'd accepted a terrible responsibility. These were humanity's monsters, the men and women who'd been asked to sacrifice their humanity to save everything they loved. "The situation has continued to deteriorate," Chen began, activating a holographic display that showed the current state of the galactic conflict. Red markers indicated systems that had been consumed by the Devourers, while blue markers showed the positions of remaining Council fleets. The amount of red was staggering. In just 5 days, the enemy had swept through nearly 30 star systems. "Our mission is simple," she continued. "We will proceed to the Andromeda Junction and stop the Devourer advance. Rules of engagement are weapons-free. No restrictions, no limitations, no mercy. The Council has specifically requested that we employ all available assets, including those that were banned under the Treaty of Centauri Prime." Captain Morrison raised his hand. "Admiral, what about collateral damage protocols? Some of our weapons have effects that can persist for decades after deployment." Chen's expression was stone cold. "The Council has accepted full responsibility for any long-term effects of our operations." Their exact words were, "Better a galaxy poisoned by human weapons than a galaxy consumed by the Devourers." A heavy silence fell over the room as the implications sank in. They were being given permission to use weapons that could render entire star systems uninhabitable, to deploy tactics that would haunt the survivors for generations. The Council wasn't just asking for their help, they were asking humanity to become the galaxy's executioners. "How long do we have?" asked Commander Brooks, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who'd once served as Marine Assault Commander aboard the Hell's Gate. "Intelligence suggests the Devourers will reach the core worlds within 2 weeks if their current advance continues unchecked," Chen replied. "We have perhaps 10 days to reach the junction and prepare our defensive positions. After that, it's a straight fight between us and an enemy that's already proven it can destroy anything the Council can throw at it." The briefing continued for 3 more hours, covering tactical deployments, supply chains, and contingency plans. As the meeting broke up, the command staff began the final preparations for a journey that would take them beyond the edge of known space to confront an enemy that existed only to consume and destroy. 6 hours later, the darkest fleet departed Ganymede Station in a formation that would have been instantly recognizable to any enemy of humanity. They moved in the perfect hunting pattern, a deployment that maximized their ability to bring overwhelming firepower to bear while minimizing their exposure to enemy weapons. At the fleet's heart was the Absolute Zero, Admiral Chen's flagship, surrounded by the heavy destroyers and battle cruisers that formed the fleet's primary striking force. As they accelerated toward the edge of the solar system, their drives began to sing the harmony that had once struck terror into the hearts of the galaxy's enemies. It was a sound that had been absent from space for 20 years, the voice of humanity's darkest angels returning to the void. Behind them, Earth continued its slow rotation, peaceful and blue and utterly unaware that its most terrible children were once again preparing to do monstrous things in its name. The darkest fleet was going to war, and the galaxy would soon remember why humans were the only species to ever survive on a death world, and then choose to carry that violence to the stars. The Andromeda Junction had once been the crown jewel of galactic civilization, a massive space station complex that served as the primary hub for interstellar trade and diplomacy. When the darkest fleet arrived, they found only twisted metal and debris fields that stretched across 3 solar systems. The Devourers had been thorough in their destruction, leaving nothing but the skeletal remains of what had been home to 40 million beings. Admiral Chen stood on the bridge of the Absolute Zero, studying the tactical displays that showed the approaching enemy fleet. The Devourers moved like a plague of mechanical locusts, their ships writhing and shifting in patterns that hurt to look at directly. Intelligence estimates had been conservative. The enemy force contained over 3,000 vessels, ranging from small fighter analogs to massive planet strippers that could consume entire worlds in a matter of hours. "Contact from the Council Fleet remnants," reported Lieutenant Torres. "Admiral Kathak of the Hegemony requests permission to coordinate joint operations." Chen almost smiled at the irony. 20 years ago, Admiral Kathak had been one of the strongest voices calling for the darkest fleet's decommissioning. The proud warrior had argued that humanity's weapons were too dangerous, too indiscriminate, too brutal for civilized warfare. Now he was asking for their help against an enemy that recognized no limits, no mercy, no honor. "Put him through," Chen ordered. The holographic projection of Admiral Kathak materialized on the bridge, and Chen was shocked by what she saw. The mighty Hegemony commander looked haggard and defeated, his ornate battle armor scarred and blackened. Behind him, she could see the emergency lighting of a ship that had taken severe damage. "Admiral Chen," Kathak began, his voice carrying the weight of absolute despair. We are grateful for your arrival. The enemy has destroyed 70% of our combined fleets. They adapt to our weapons faster than we can deploy them. Our planet killers barely scratch their hull plating. Our gravitational weapons are absorbed and redirected back at us. We have lost 6-star destroyers in the last 4 hours alone." "What about their tactics?" Chen asked. "Do they still use the same swarm formations we encountered during the original war?" Kathak's expression grew even grimmer. "No, Admiral. They've evolved. They now employ coordinated battle group formations, strategic feints, and what appears to be predictive targeting systems. They're not just consuming our fleets, they're out fighting them." Chen nodded, her mind already processing the tactical implications. The Devourers had learned from their previous defeat, adapting not just their technology, but their entire approach to warfare. They were no longer the mindless swarm that had nearly overwhelmed the galaxy 2 decades ago. They had become something far more dangerous. "Admiral Kathak," she said quietly, "I need you to withdraw your remaining forces to the outer system. What we're about to do, your crews shouldn't witness it, and your ships need to be well clear of the engagement zone." The alien admiral's eyes widened with understanding and something that might have been relief. "Admiral, are you authorizing the use of—" He couldn't finish the sentence. "All available assets," Chen confirmed. "No restrictions. No mercy. The Council requested our help in stopping this enemy. We're going to give them exactly what they asked for." As the Council forces withdrew to safe distance, the Darkest Fleet began its final approach to the Devourer formation. The enemy ships detected their presence immediately, their formations shifting to intercept the human vessels. But something was wrong. The Devourer's advance slowed, then stopped entirely as their sensors tried to make sense of what they were detecting. "They're confused," reported Commander Yang from the weapons console. "Their tactical analysis systems can't classify our ship configurations. They're trying to determine our threat level." Captain Morrison's voice came over the fleet communications channel. "Looks like they don't have us in their databases anymore. 20 years of modifications and upgrades have made us unrecognizable." Chen smiled coldly. The Darkest Fleet had not remained static during its supposed decommissioning. Each ship had been continuously upgraded with weapons and systems that pushed the boundaries of what was considered acceptable by galactic standards. They were no longer just the vessels that had fought the original war. They were something entirely new and infinitely more dangerous. "All ships," Chen announced over the fleet-wide channel, "initiate Omega Protocol. Authorization Chen Alpha 77. Weapons free, no limitations, engage at will." The response was immediate and terrifying. The inevitable end opened fire with its newly installed temporal disruption cannon, a weapon that accelerated the flow of time within its target area. The first Devourer ship to be hit aged 10,000 years in the space of 3 seconds, its hull crumbling to cosmic dust as entropy claimed it. The broken chain activated its psychological warfare suite, broadcasting signals that drove the enemy ship's controlling intelligences into recursive logic loops that left them helpless and drifting. But it was the absolute zero that fired the shot that changed everything. Admiral Chen had authorized the deployment of the Reality Shear Torpedo, a weapon that had been deemed too dangerous for use even during the darkest days of the original war. The torpedo punched a hole through the fabric of space-time itself, creating a cascade effect that spread through the enemy formation like a cancer. The Devourers tried to adapt, their ships morphing and shifting as they attempted to counter the human weapons. But humanity had learned from their previous encounters as well. For every adaptation the enemy made, the Darkest Fleet had prepared a counter-adaptation. When the Devourers developed shields against temporal weapons, the humans deployed probability bombs that made it statistically impossible for their targets to continue existing. When the enemy tried to jam the psychological warfare broadcasts, humanity activated weapons that attacked the quantum foundations of consciousness itself. "Enemy formation is beginning to collapse," reported Dr. Vasquez from the Quantum Ghost. "Their command and control systems are failing. They can't coordinate a response to our attack pattern." But the Devourers were not finished. As their fleet began to disintegrate under the human assault, they activated their most desperate weapon, a planet stripper beam that began consuming the dead worlds in the junction system, converting matter directly into pure energy. The beam swept toward the Darkest Fleet, a wave of destruction that could unmake anything it touched. "All ships emergency maneuvers," Chen ordered. "Prepare for pattern Omega-7 defensive formation." The fleet responded with the precision that came from years of training in humanity's most classified tactical doctrines. The ships scattered and regrouped in a formation that seemed to defy the laws of physics, their positions calculated to create a resonance effect that would turn the enemy's planet stripper beam back on itself. The beam struck the formation and screamed. There was no other word for the sound that emerged from the intersection of reality-warping technologies, a noise that registered on sensors as a fundamental protest from the universe itself. The energy wave that should have destroyed the human fleet instead rebounded, amplified by the resonance effect, and tore through the Devourer formation like a scythe through wheat. What followed was not so much a battle as an execution. The Darkest Fleet methodically dismantled the remaining enemy ships, using weapons that existed in violation of several natural laws and tactics that would have been considered war crimes if they'd been used against any species capable of surrendering. But the Devourers had never shown mercy, had never offered quarter, had never recognized any authority except their own hunger. So humanity showed them exactly what they themselves had always been. The Hell's Gate deployed its Marines aboard the few surviving enemy vessels, but these were not normal soldiers. They were humans who'd been trained to fight in environments that would kill most species instantly. They carved through the Devourer ships like a plague, leaving nothing living in their wake. The final solution used its reality shear drive to literally delete sections of enemy ships from existence, creating holes in space-time that swallowed everything nearby. Within 6 hours, the largest Devourer fleet in recorded history had been reduced to drifting wreckage and expanding gas clouds. The survivors, if the term could be applied to beings that existed only as distributed consciousness across quantum networks, transmitted a single message before fleeing back into the void between galaxies. The Deathworlders have returned. All fleets withdraw. Withdraw! Admiral Chen watched the last enemy ships disappear into hyperspace, their retreat so hasty that several vessels tore themselves apart in their panic to escape. Around the Darkest Fleet, space itself was wounded. Reality bore scars that would take centuries to heal, and several star systems would remain uninhabitable for millennia. But the galaxy was safe. "Admiral," came Kathak's voice over the communication channel, "the Council fleets are requesting permission to approach and offer assistance." Chen considered the offer for a moment, then shook her head. "Negative, Admiral. Tell them to maintain safe distance until our weapons finish cycling down. Some of our systems remain unstable." It was a polite way of saying that several ships in the Darkest Fleet were still radiating enough exotic energy to kill any non-human who came too close. The weapons that had saved the galaxy were the same ones that made their users untouchable to the rest of civilization. Over the next week, as the fleet made its way back toward Terran space, reports began filtering in from across the galaxy. The Devourers' retreat had been total and absolute. Every enemy ship had fled beyond the galactic rim, abandoning their forward bases and leaving behind enough technology for the Council races to study for centuries. The threat that had nearly consumed galactic civilization had been broken by humanity's willingness to become something that even monsters feared. But the victory came with a price that was measured in more than just the wounded space around the Andromeda Junction. The crews of the Darkest Fleet had once again proven that humans could become whatever was necessary to protect what they loved, even if it meant sacrificing their own humanity in the process. They had saved the galaxy by reminding it why Earth was considered a death world, and why its children were the only species in known space that had learned to weaponize their own willingness to become monsters. As the Absolute Zero approached Earth's orbital space, Admiral Chen stood once again at the viewport in her ready room, watching her home world grow larger in the distance. The planet looked as peaceful and blue as it had when she'd left, but she knew that something fundamental had changed. Humanity had proven, once again, that when pushed to the edge, they would step over any line, cross any boundary, and become anything necessary to survive. The Darkest Fleet would return to its storage orbits around the outer planets. Its crews would return to their quiet lives on Earth's surface, and the galaxy would once again pretend that humanity's most terrible capabilities were safely locked away. But everyone would remember the lesson that had been taught at the Andromeda Junction. The species that survived on a death world had learned to carry that darkness with them to the stars, and when necessary, they could unleash it with devastating effect. In the years that followed, historians would struggle to find the right words to describe what had happened during those 6 hours of combat. Military analysts would spend decades trying to understand weapons that operated outside the normal parameters of physics. Philosophers would debate whether humanity's willingness to become monsters in defense of civilization was heroic or horrifying. But for the crews of the darkest fleet, the answer was simple. They were what they had always been, survivors from a world that had tried to kill them since birth, carrying the lessons of that harsh teacher to a galaxy that sometimes needed to be reminded that the universe was not a safe place, and that sometimes the only way to preserve civilization was to become something that civilization could not tolerate. The Deathworlders had saved the galaxy once again, and the stars themselves would remember their passage for eons to come.